Said he'll join us, but
Greetings and welcome. I'm Danielle Smith, Professor of African American Studies in the Department of African American Studies, College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University. I begin with acknowledgement of the Haudenosaunee on whose land we study, we work on, we benefit from living on their land. I share greetings with members and friends of Africa Initiative on behalf of the Africa Initiative Forum. The Africa Initiative is a forum wherein intellectuals from diverse backgrounds, experiences, places of origin, and academic and career goals convene to engage in conversations that prioritize decolonizing knowledge to represent the experiences of Indigenous people who have been previously excluded from these conversations. We are committed as scholars to centering Africa within African and African diaspora studies. Our diversity is our unique strength, which allows us to explore varying dimensions of African and African diasporic experiences. For me, this strength is especially evident through the work of Pan-African Studies graduate students. To learn more about Africa Initiative, the Pan-African Studies Master's Program, and the Department of African American Studies, please visit the department's website. Next, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mario Nisbett, who has joined the Department of African American Studies as a visiting assistant teaching professor. In the department, Dr. Nisbett will teach classes in African international relations, Caribbean society, and Pan-Africanism. Prior to joining Syracuse University, Dr. Nisbett was a lecturer at the Center for African and International Studies at the University of Cape Coast, UCC, in Ghana, where he teaches the courses African in Dispersion, Pan-Africanism, and African Economies and Development. His research interests are in the history and politics of Africa and the African diaspora. He has contributed chapters to edited volumes, including Claiming Asante, the Akan Origins of Jamaican Maroons, which appeared in the Asante World, 17th to 21st century. His journal publications include Defining and Utilizing Diaspora in Contemporary Journal of African Studies. He is the author of the book, The Workings of Diaspora, published by Lexington Books in 2021. Dr. Nisbett earned a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA from Morgan State University, and a BA from the University of the Virgin Islands. To our audience, I thank you for taking the time to join us for Dr. Nisbett's presentation, The Workings of Diaspora, Jamaican Maroons and the Claims to Sovereignty. Following his presentation, I encourage you to share your own perspectives so that we can participate in the richest possible learning experience that Africa Initiative is known for. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nisbett.
Thank you for your warm introduction, Dr. Smith. I thank everyone for coming on. As the introduction mentioned, The Working of Diaspora is my first book project, and it was published last year, actually around this time, November 5th of last year, so it's about a year old. I present basically the book itself and the things that are covered in the different chapters. And then I hope we have a conversation afterwards. Could we go to the next slide? Okay, so the main goal of the book was to look at how diaspora, the idea of diaspora, is practiced in African descended communities. In particular, I focus on the Jamaican Maroon communities as a case study. So, next slide. So, in laying out the chapters, this is the introduction. The introduction really focusing on trying to understand what exactly is diaspora and how it is used. So I first started off by exploring diasporic framing, or the idea of Africans and African descended people as being connected. I saw this before the term emerged itself, where you have Equiano, you have Edie, you have Du Bois involved in this idea of connecting Africa and African diaspora and resisting oppression that they face. So in the work, I look at how in the 1950s and 60s, we started having a more meaningful definition of diaspora, starting particularly with Joseph Harris, where he defined what diaspora is. And I look at different definitions of diaspora, academic defense of diaspora, and I noted, including Stuart Hall, and I noted that there were mainly three elements that keep coming up, and those were the ideas of abjection, which I'll elaborate on, origins, and collective consciousness. When we are talking about not just diaspora in general, but African diaspora in particular. And so I propose a definition of diaspora itself in terms of the African diaspora is a condition that produces the shared consciousness of sameness rooted in the idea of common African origins and based on a common experience of Black abjection. So within the work itself, I explore those three concepts that I mentioned, and the book tried to engage how this particular community of Maroons engage those three particular concepts and to what purpose they engage these concepts. Go to the next slide. So the first chapter is actually focused on the Jamaican Maroon community itself. So the first chapter explores the origins of the Jamaican Maroon communities, which emerged during African resistance to enslavement, starting during the Spanish occupation of Jamaica, during the Spanish colonization of Jamaica in the early 1500s. And subsequently in the 1955, the British invaded, but the Maroons, and I'm privileged in the Maroons' perspective, the Maroons argue that they started rebelling from the plantation and going up into the mountains of Jamaica and creating an independent community outside of the plantation. And this continued during also too when the British, the English rather, invasion in 1655, where more Africans went to the mountain and joined Maroon communities, or even created their own Maroon communities. And so I also look at how Maroon communities are defined in Jamaica itself, but I gave it a wider context because you have Maroon communities known in Brazil as Quilombos, in Colombia, Palenques, but all over the Western Hemisphere. There wasn't any way that they had slavery that they didn't have Maroon communities. Even in the small islands, they have Maroon communities. And when the communities, when the plantation system grew larger in the small islands, many Africans migrated from the small islands to neighboring islands like St. Vincent and Dominica to resist European colonialism in the Caribbean. So in Jamaica around 1738, 1739, the Maroons actually signed a treaty with the British government. You see about 5 communities emerging during this time period. The Maroons argue that they have fought the British from since 1655, up until this time period where they signed a treaty with the British government. And there were mainly 5 communities that emerged in this time period. And during this time period, there was a second Maroon. So there was a period called the First Maroon War that happened around the 1930s when the British decided that they wanted to completely remove the Maroons from Jamaica. Their attempt wasn't successful. Many of the British soldiers were defeated, and the British was concerned about losing the whole island. So they basically signed a treaty with the Maroons. And so then in around 1795, there was actually a second Maroon War. And it was the Trelawney Maroon that fought, but other Maroons didn't get involved in the war. But the Trelawney Maroons were defeated in 1796, and most of them were deported to Canada before they ended up in Sierra Leone. So they still have descendants actually in Canada today, colleagues that I know actually in Canada today, and they have some also in Sierra Leone today. And so within that chapter, I looked at the issue of Maroon sovereignty autonomy during the colonial period. So at times, the Maroon communities operated as like autonomous units within Jamaica. Other times, depending on the strength of the British, they sometimes were under the influence of the British. But it becomes complicated because there are many different perspectives and views about this particular history. So in that sense, I did a broad history of Maroon community covering almost 300 years within about 20 pages. So, so the next slide I go, you got the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the next slide, I look at Black abjection, which is basically called through the Europeans' endeavor to banish African people from the domain of humanity. So this is an attempt, and objection itself is the idea of objection is the idea of removing someone from being full human or having the full rights of a human being. So this happens to basically different groups of people at different times, whether it is in terms of gender, it happens in terms of gender, it happens in terms of class, it happens in terms of religious belief system. But in particular, I look at it how it relates in terms of race. So in the text, I also look at race as a race as a construct, a social construct, but a social construct that has, dire implication for people of African descent. And so in this process of dehumanizing African people is one of the ways why diaspora emerges. So if you look at diaspora in different places, it's often because in somehow the group of people who form the diaspora, they are not accepted and included within the society that they are living or currently living in. They feel displaced. So oftentimes that creates a desire to connect with a place that they could consider home, a place that they could consider their origin. So within the colonial states of Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, the apparatus of the state, whether including the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, created a system for over 300 years that excluded people of African descent and treated them as non-human. Although they were acknowledgement of their humanity, they were effort to remove them from humanity. So this is well known in the publication of the time, including the local newspapers, but also to major publications. But also part of the work in that chapter, I try to also look at how it's also very much in philosophy of all the European political thought. So you have individuals like Hobbes and Locke, where they would argue that if you are not meaningfully contributing to society, you should not be a part of society. So you have where genocide is committed against the indigenous people because the perception is that if they're using land and they're not being productive on it, they shouldn't have the right to own land. But the philosophy also creates a justification where it's okay to kill the savage, it's okay to kill the barbarian. So in many ways, it created a society where everyone was organized in the society to oppress Africans if they tried to in any way remove themselves from the system. So you would have enslaved Africans crush rebellions, you would have free Africans who would have to participate in crushing rebellions. You would have free whites who will also have to participate in crushing rebellions. So everyone in the society is mobilized against groups of Africans that try to resist the system. And this foundational act is created, you see it in every society in the Western Hemisphere. Every society in the Western Hemisphere were created by individuals who were white supremacists, and they created a society that the Africans were not considered fully human. And this happened for over 300 years. And in other parts of Latin America, you would have laws that were referred to as whitening, where efforts were used to remove African from the population because the idea of being African or being Black is a sort of opposite of being civilized. So countries in the Western Hemisphere try to be civilized by being, in many ways, becoming white. Could we go to the next slide? So in terms of Africans experiencing Black abjection, people of African descent that argue in the world go and try to identify a place that they came from, where they could feel a sense of belonging. So this is, I think, is also a crucial part of diaspora. And so even though some authors like Paul Gilroy would speak about routes rather than roots, even though I think that, even though when you speak about routes, it's often linked to roots in terms of origins. So the Maroon communities in particular in Jamaica, they make linkages to other people of African descent, but to Africa itself. And they do this in a particular way where, through the oral traditions, they will tell you that their origins are from the African continent. They come from many different groups of Africans, but they focus on particularly Ghana, the Gold Coast, because they believe they have a strong connection to the Akan people in Ghana. So in Maroon oral tradition, and also in their material culture and tangible and tangible cultural expressions, they have connections to the African continent, which they use as a means of rooting themselves in the culture and rooting themselves in terms of being human beings and being able to survive conditions of slavery and colonialism. So in terms of intangible connections, in the text I look at the Koromati language. This language is closely, and most scholars argue that it's definitely based in Twi, the local language that is spoken in Ghana, the most popular language spoken in Ghana, but also they highlight the political system, the land tenure system, and the spiritual system to also Africa and Akan. They also have storytelling traditions such as the Nancy stories, psalm ceremony, ritual performance that is also tied to the origins of the African continent, in particular, what is known today as Ghana. But in terms of tangible connections, their communities, in terms of the naming of the community, in particular, two of them, we have affirm. It is believed that it's come from the word affirm, which is a popular name in Tria, in Ghana among the accounts. And then also too, you have Kojotan, which is also very popular in Ghana among the accounts. But the Maroons also have secret sites such as the Kinda, which is a location within the community, which I will elaborate on a bit more. You also have sealed ground where Maroons refer to areas, 60 areas in the community where you can connect with the ancestors and ancestral spirits. And they also have burial grounds, which are ancestors such as the Ashantis and Coromantee and Congo ancestors. And then we also have objects, which is the Beng and Gombe drum in Maroon communities. And they also have the Sofa Yard and the Shanty Hut in terms of naming specific sites within their communities. In terms of connecting to their origins. Could we go to the next slide? So the last other point is collective consciousness. So I also explore collective consciousness in terms of the Maroon community. Internally, Maroons believe that they are from the same place in terms of how they emerge, during the Spanish period of British colonization. And there's a place called Kinda in the Maroon community, but also the Maroon community also speak of Kinda as being a relation and as being connection. And also Kinda is the place where the Akampa Maroons believe that where the different groups of Maroons gather together. They were from different backgrounds, whether they are Congo, Igbo. They gathered in a place called Kinda within the community, and they decided to fight together as a group, collectively come together to fight together as a group to challenge the British and to create their own community. And so within also Maroon community, they also have the idea of the communities made up of the ancestors. Those ancestors and the communities are also made up of those who are living and those who are unborn, or those who are offspring in many ways. And they believe that when you're making decisions and doing things, you should consult the whole community, not just only those who live in or only the leadership, but you should consult the ancestors and you should consider what is best for the children and children after that. So internally, they created collective consciousness among themselves. And most recently, more or less in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, into the 21st century, they make external link to other people of African descent. So the Maroons would argue that their site is the first place, and they would argue to sometimes that before the United States was independent, the Maroon community was independent from since 1938. And so we are African people that came to Jamaica, and we created our societies here, and we have continued our tradition today. They see themselves as ambassadors to this community, and they invite people from many different parts of the world across the Americas, but they also invite people from other parts of the world to celebrate their freedom with them and to encourage other people of African descent to embrace the African ancestry and celebrate their freedom. This image is the former colonel and the president of Ghana in 2015. So oftentimes you have delegations from Ghana itself coming to Jamaica, sometimes to the Maroon community, and a few times some delegations came from Jamaica itself, from the Maroon communities going to Ghana itself to make contact sometimes. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, and so the fifth chapter, I suppose should be, yes, the fifth chapter, sovereignty claims. So today in Jamaica, the Maroons still argue that they are sovereign communities. So Maroons argue their sovereignty by using two different means, two main means of arguing their sovereignty, maybe three. So the Maroons, they argue that they came from Africa and they came to the Americas and they were able to continue. They will have kingdoms in Africa where they were free, they were enslaved, they rebelled against the plantation, and they went up into the mountains and created their own society. This is what most Maroons would say, but you have also another argument among Maroons too, that they actually mixed with some of the indigenous people, like the Tainos who were indigenous to Jamaica. Many of them were wiped out during the Spanish colonization, but a few of them, some studies have been done to highlight that they do have indigenous ancestries, although it's very small and they still need to do more research on it to find out about the depth of it. But some Maroons also connect to that, connect to Tainos to say also, we have always been sovereign. You know, we never lost our sovereignty. So the question of whether we are sovereign or not is linked to this Taino past, the African past. And then in 1739 or 38, they believe the signing of the treaty was only acknowledgement of them, rather than, it didn't create sovereignty, but it was the British acknowledgement of their sovereignty by signing treaties with them. And you have in terms of the Maroon political organization, So at the time I was in the community in around 2014, and I saw Colonel, the leader of the community is called a Colonel or a chief. So Colonel William in this picture with the current Prime Minister of Jamaica in 2009. This was in 2019. But when I interviewed him, he had a council, a senior council, and he also had a junior council, and he also had a full Maroon council. So the governance structure, they argue, is like how the governance structure on the continent of Africa, especially Ghana, in terms of the chief being the leader of the community, and the chief represent the community, and also to he speak of the council having the senior council, which is made up of elders, but there were a junior council, which made up of many youths in the community, and then the full Maroon council was sought in some ways like a legislative branch that the community was trying to reform the political system in some ways to be more democratic in some ways. So also in Akampong, unlike the other three other Maroon communities, they have had elections every 5 years since the 1950s. And they also have communally held land from since the 1700s when they signed the treaty with the British. Their land is communally held. So this is also, in the Maroon community set, is a challenge to Western models of development where for the last 300 years, the Maroons have been fighting with the Jamaican state, the British state now with the Jamaican state, in terms of land should be communally held. There are many times where the British attempted to reward the communities by asking them to parcel up the land to individual people, but the Maroon consider the land to be the land that they won during the war. The land is a secret place, and it should be communally held. And when anything is done to the land, it is linked to the environment. So Maroons in Jamaica, they are opposed to bauxite. So there's bauxite mining in Jamaica that happened. It's happening in Jamaica since the 1950s and 60s. And American companies were involved. And most recently, American companies and Chinese have been involved in bauxite mining. So the Maroon communities have been united in terms of being against mining of the land because of the harmful effects that bauxite have caused to the communities that are surrounding these mining sites. So the Maroons have an environmental view that believe that the land belongs to ancestors, those who are living and for the children. And if the mining is going to harm that relationship, they believe that it shouldn't be done. So this is actually have been a big contentious issue in Jamaica, where recently the Prime Minister of Jamaica made an announcement that the Maroons are not a sovereign state in Jamaica, and that the Jamaican state would not tolerate any group calling themselves sovereign in Jamaica. Even though in 2019 he was at the Maroon, this event was at the Maroon annual celebration where they celebrate the independence. And so he was there at the independence and it was okay, but 2020-21, when bauxite became a significant issue, then there was separation in terms of Maroon and their desire for autonomy. But within the community too, there are also symbols of independence, sovereignty in terms of constitution. So the most recent constitution was actually written in 2022. There's a new leader, Colonel Williams, was voted out of office at the end of 2021. And there is a new leader, his name is Colonel Curry, and he's much more vocal in terms of Maroon sovereignty and autonomy. The community also has its own flag. And then they created a bank about 5-6 years ago. They created a bank within their community. And the Jamaican government argued that you cannot have a bank in your community. But the Maroon community challenges them in terms of saying that we're independent, we could have a bank in our community if we want to. They also created a currency. That currency was much more controversial in terms of the backing of the currency, but the past colonel supported the currency, but the new colonel Curry, he doesn't support the currency because he isn't quite sure of the backend and how it's being utilized. So these are some of the symbols of sovereignty, and it's also very much debated. Next slide. So this is a chart of the different leaders in the community. So from the 1720s, Kojo was the original, Senior was the original founder of the community. And in our compound in particular, this is just one of the communities. And so there's a long list of different leaders, but the community have always been made up of males. But recently in Williams' administration, about half of the ministers are female. And in some of the other communities, you have female leaders, like especially Nani, when it comes to Nanitan or Motown Maroons, they have all their female leaders. The next slide. And then this is an image. This was on the Maroon website page of the different ministers in the government, former government. So Colonel William was the colonel, and Melvin Curry, he was the deputy colonel, but he recently passed away actually earlier this year. And none of family members of his became colonel. And so there are different ministries in government, in their government, where they're responsible for different things. But it's also it's a rural community, so most of the ministers, as you can see, land and agriculture is dedicated to that. So the community main means of income is actually through agriculture, but they are developing tourist industry within the community, which the Jamaican government is interested into something. Like when they have the annual celebration, which is January 6th, they have figures of over 10,000 people come to the community and celebrate with the community and bring also in terms of discussions. They have lively discussions in terms of what it is to be of Africa, of African descent. They have different celebrations going back. So they argue that this celebration has been happened every year going back to the signing of the treaty itself. And from my studies, except for 1 or 2 years, they have had a celebration for the whole of the 20th century. And definitely for the 21st century, they always have a celebration. And even last year, they had a celebration even during COVID, where they asked people to wear masks, and they actually had Zoom. They actually had a lot of the celebration on Zoom and YouTube, so people were able to participate in the event. Next slide. So in concluding the work, my presentation, the chapter, what I wanted to do was use the Maroon community to highlight different communities of African descent engage the concept of diaspora, African diaspora, in distinctive ways, and how these communities engage the African diaspora and its core element, abjection, origin, and shared consciousness, informs the meaning of emancipatory politics toward the ultimate goal of total recognition of the full humanity of people of African descent. These means are articulated and critically practiced, varying over time, place, and space. And if you use diaspora as an analytical tool, African diaspora as an analytical tool, it reveals how Maroon communities uniquely seek to improve Black standing, notably through claims enhancing the idea of assertion of sovereignty. So I also argue that if you look at other grouping of people of African descent, if you look how they engage those concepts, you would see perhaps a different way. Like, for example, if you look at Rastafari, they would trace their origins to Africa itself, but they would highlight Ethiopia. They would believe that the solution or answer to improving community is living a life that is honest, that is more in tune with the environment and created in many ways what they would say Zion on earth. So part of this goes towards the argument that there are different ways of Black people engage in this concept of diaspora. And so with that, I end my presentation. Thank you for indulging me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nisbett. Just very informative, very enriching. I know everyone has a lot to think about and or thinking about questions. As we think about questions, I would like to recognize faculty who are here with us. Professor Sangpan is here, Professor Jerry Greenberg, the interim chair of the department. And I know that Professor Horace Campbell is on Zoom. If there are others that I didn't recognize. Oh, Herb is here. Professor Ruffin is joining us by Zoom. So with those recognitions, I will open the floor up to questions or comments. And I know it takes a minute to think about questions and yeah.
I would be leaving, so let me I'm a little bit puzzled. Why is it that the Maroons in Jamaica would be always willing, eager to make contact with Ghanaians? What is their relationship with Sierra Leoneans, who happen to be their direct, what should I say, cousins? Is there any relationship at all with Sierra Leone, and what kind of relationship is it?
Thank you for the question. There isn't much relationship with Sierra Leone. A group of Maroons about 10 years ago went to visit Sierra Leone and they met some of the descendants from the communities in Sierra Leone. But they focus more on Ghana and Akan because they believe that, like, for example, the leader of the community, Akampong, the leader of the community, founder of the community, his name was Kojo, and they believe that he was actually born in Ghana, but also to the language that they speak, which they spoke a language that is called Koromanti, and it was much more popular in the past, and today it's more, there are more phrases and words that are in Koromanti, but it's tied, definitely closely tied to Tree language spoken in Ghana. So when it was much more vibrant of a language, scholars, especially in the early 1900s, they would have been to the community, have looked at the community, and definitely the words in their language was very closely tied to Akan language. And in fact, in the 1940s or so, there was professor, no, I think maybe the 50s or 60s, there was a professor from the University of Ghana that actually came to the Maroon communities, and he argued that they were speaking Tree, that they were speaking the Akan language, the pure Akan language. And so you have like a lot of evidence. Also too, they have an instrument called abeng, which is a horn instrument, and in Ghana itself, they call a horn instrument abeng. And for the Maroon communities, even in archival documents from the emergence of the Maroon communities, they have been using abeng in their society as a means of, it's like a horn instrument actually used to use during battle. And so within even the Maroon community today, they have a member of the government that is called the abeng blower. And he usually blow the abeng if someone passed away, they're having a celebration, they would blow the abeng. But during the time of the war with the British, they used to use the abeng to speak to each other, signal each other about where the British are coming, how they are moving. And in 2014, when I went to Ghana, I went to a friend of mine's at the University of Ghana. He's an Ashanti, and they had their annual celebration in Kumasi, and we went to see the Ashanti heading, and there actually saw where in Jamaica the abeng was like maybe one size about this big. But when I went to the celebration actually Kumasi, they had abengs this size, like this size, some like even this size. And so it's, so, you know, with the different symbols of the community, they tie themselves to Ghana in particular, and they also have a burial ground in their community that they call the Ashanti burial ground. So they also tie closely to Ghana and also to their religious practice. They also call it Coromantee, which is also tied to Ghana itself, to Akan. So they have a lot of expressive cultural expression to Akan, and also in their oral tradition, like I mentioned in terms of storytelling. Like Nancy stories is said all over the Caribbean, but among the Maroon communities is very popular. These Nancy stories are stories that come from the Akan people in West Africa. And even when I went to Ghana myself and I heard the same Akan stories in Jamaica, in the Maroon community, I heard the same ones in in Ghana among different Akan groups. The groups in Ghana, their Nancy stories were much more detailed and nuanced, but the ones in Jamaica were still had the same message in many ways and the same content. So that's why I make the connections.
So we'll have a question from the audience, and then Shukri, can you moderate questions from the chat, and then we can go back.
So far, there are no questions in the chat.
I kind of have two questions, but they like come from separate things. The first one was kind of related to the question asked about why specifically Ghana. And my question is, like, the Akan people, they're not just Ghanaian, like, and nationality people, like they're in other neighboring countries as well, like in Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. How did the, I guess, decision-making process work to like specifically connect with the Ghanaian ancestors? Because like these divisions from what the ethnic groups happen through colonial division of borders, and not necessarily like the separation of the communities itself. So how did they make the decision that they will specifically be related to the Akan or the Ashanti people of Ghana?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the Maroons, they come from and they acknowledge it too, they come from different groups of people. So, you know, but what is interesting is also they identify actually almost with Ashanti more than any other group. And I think it also has to do with the influence of the Ashanti themselves. That's why I think they connect more with Ashanti. If you look also to in some of the older stories, like especially in the 40s, they had a period of time where they actually connected a lot with the Igbos in Nigeria. So I think in many ways they have different groups within the Maroons themselves, but they identify with the Akan, I think, most and to Ghana because one, I think they were colonized by the British, so there is that linguistic connection versus say Ivory Coast or Togo in terms of the Akan, in terms of the language, but also I think they have heard reports over the years about the Ashanti and their influence, and I think that they connect with a group in Africa that they felt was strong and powerful. Because so part of my argument is I'm looking more at why they are connecting, not so much the verifying whether or not it's true that they are connecting. Because in many ways, what is interesting, for example, I mentioned a Gombe drum. And if you speak to a lot of Jamaican Maroons, they would tell you that Gombe drum came from Ghana, you know Ghana. But recently, as a researcher came out and actually argues that the Gombe drum is actually indigenous to the Maroon community. It actually was created there. And the drums that you are seeing in Ghana, Professor Jackson argued, is that actually how the Gombe drum got to Ghana and actually to parts of West Africa was actually to the Maroons that were defeated in 1796 and were deported to Canada, and then they were sent to Sierra Leone. They actually took the drum to Sierra Leone, and the drum actually spread to different parts of West Africa, up to 15 different countries in West Africa, going back to Ghana itself. So, you know, so some of the stories are means of connecting to a particular history or culture or past to position themselves as being deserving of humanity. in many ways.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And then, another question that I had was more related now to like, I guess the political side of it, with the discussions of sovereignty. So in recent years, you mentioned that, the colonials of the Maroon people in Jamaica have been facing kind of like a battle with the Jamaican government itself, like, in regards to their sovereignty. The sovereignty claim from the Maroons, how is that like? Because I'm a master's student in international relations, so like, how does that work regarding like international recognition and international like affairs and stuff like? Because are they just saying they're sovereign within Jamaica where they're able to govern their own lands, or does that extend beyond that?
Just because I want to tack on like one question, like how do you also define sovereignty? In your work?
Yes, so it's complicated a bit. So when I first went to visit the community, I went to visit all 4 communities, and there were different reception in the 4 communities, of course. But the community I spent the most of the time in was the African Maroon community is in Western Jamaica, up in the hills in Western Jamaica. And I didn't think too much about sovereignty when I first came to the community, but you would even hear in the mouths of like children, 5-year-old, we are sovereign community. And one time I was speaking to one of the leaders of the community, and I used the word autonomy, and she was like, sovereignty is different from autonomy. You know, like you keep saying autonomy, you know, and so they use the word that we are sovereign. And when I try to get to, you know, what the sovereignty is, because usually when you think of sovereignty of having control of a particular space of land and the people within it in terms of having exclusive control of it. And that's how sovereignty is defined by the Jamaican state. But for the Maroons themselves, their idea of sovereignty is complicated by, they have the idea of interdependence, belief in interdependence, where that they could be sovereign, but still be interdependent. Like, and they believe that the Jamaican state could help them when they need help, and they still could be sovereign. And they could help the Jamaican state when they need help, and the Jamaican state could still be sovereign. But also to the issue came up where, when they started having a dispute with the Jamaican state over sovereignty, they would respond in many ways that that the Jamaican state is not really sovereign. The head of the Jamaican state is the Queen of England, not the King of England. And Jamaican state, they go and they beg people for money to survive. Like they sort of brought that criticism to them, and then they start saying like, you know, are you really sovereign? Because we signed a treaty with the British, and so it's the British that we have the issue with, and that we are sovereign, and they need to recognize our sovereignty. But for most part, though, I think that it's more of it is a struggle of controlling the Maroons, controlling their destiny and having an influence in terms of what happened in their area. Because when you look at sovereignty, say you use the traditional sovereignty in terms of having full control of a territory, the question comes up where the schools in the community are actually Jamaican, and the electricity in the community is from the Jamaican state. You know, so they don't pay taxes to the Jamaican state directly in terms of like how the community pay taxes. They own the land belongs to the community, and the chief hold the land on behalf of the community. So they have never paid taxes to the Jamaican state in terms of control of their land. But of course they pay taxes when it comes to when you buy items and you have to pay taxes for it. They pay taxes there. So I think the issue of sovereignty really is, I more look at how they are using or pushing sovereignty, and for pushing for sovereignty is this idea of interdependence, but also the desire to control their own destiny, to be independent, to decide their own destiny, especially when it comes to the land and what is done to the land.
Have a
Professor
question.
Campbell.
Yeah.
Hello? 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 Should I proceed? Why does it sound so low? Okay, Professor Mario Nisbett, thank you for this very, very profound presentation on Pan-Africanism in the Jamaican context and Pan-Africanism in terms of how a group of people seek to transcend dehumanization. There are 3 points I would like you to think of in terms of your future research, in terms of this community of Africans in the Jamaican space. The first is the debate about where these people came from, who are called Maroons. Because in my personal discussion with Professor Beckles was arguing that there needs to be a periodization in relation to when people came from Ghana to Jamaica, and that at a certain point, especially at the second part of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century, the British changed the importation of enslaved people from the Coromantine coast to Calabar, and that most Jamaicans, contemporary Jamaicans, came from the Calabar and from the Igbos. Now, the challenge for me is that as someone growing up in that society, I've always identified as Coromantine, but Professor Beckles is arguing that the Coromantine were not the dominant people in Jamaica. Now, the question for me that I don't know if your research has pointed this out is whether the increase in taking people from the Calabar and the Igbos was a result of the fact that the Maroons were so fierce in resisting British from 1655 to 1739. So that is nearly 80 years of fighting. The British signed an agreement with them, and they not only signed the agreement with them, they decided not to add to their numbers by bringing people who could easily identify with them culturally and militarily. The second question that I think is linked to the first is that none of your chapters dealt in any great detail about the military organization of a compound town, for example, because in the geography of Jamaica, all of the Maroon communities are organized for military defense in mountain terrains, difficult to get to, where the Maroons had control over the terrain and the British could not access it. And so one would have liked to hear some more about the military tactics that they used that gave them victory and why the British had to make this treaty with them in 1739 and 1796. Because militarily, their tactics were not only tactics that they used, but they're tactics that someone like Bookman used in Haiti. And the relationship between people like Bookman and the Maroons are worth penetrating in terms of Pan-African military resistance. The third point is in relationship to sovereignty and Pan-Africanism, because I think the most important aspect of your work is that you are pointing out that there's something more important than liberal conception of sovereignty, and that is the conception of the humanity, that is the African saw themselves as human beings, because as you pointed out in your representation of Locke and Hobbes, those conceptions of sovereignty that had to do with the state or sovereignty that dehumanizes the African. So what you have done is elevated sovereignty beyond Hobson Locke, beyond liberal bourgeois international relations theory that deals with sovereignty of the state. But even in the context of the sovereignty of the state, the Maroons verified their ability to remain autonomous in relationship to policing. In other words, from 1739 until today, they have been able to ensure that the Jamaican police does not have control over arbitrating disputes or questions in their community. And one of the very important aspects of their policing is that for 250 years, there was only registered one murder among the Maroons. That is, it is a society that has been able to operate a state system that organized peace and social security for the population. But I want to thank you for this excellent presentation, and it reinforced my conception of why the global African presence is how we should formulate the presence of Africans who are overseas.
Thank you. It's a bit, so yes, I'm actually engaged in more. My next project, actually, I want to look at. It originally started where I wanted to look where I'm based in Ghana. I'm living in Ghana, where I wanted to look at how the African continent itself engaged diaspora using Ghana and maybe Ethiopia as comparatively looking at them, how they engage the African diaspora itself, like what is this desire to connect with the diaspora that you hear and the continent itself. And they usually surround the idea of development, bringing back resources. So I wanted to explore that, but I wanted to explore it more looking at the global Africa rather than one side against another, but like how do the groups collectively work together on the continent and in the diaspora, because you have many ways in Ghana. The state in terms of diaspora is interested in resources. But if you look at the organization or social group, they are more interested in mutual development and benefit. You know, so that I want to explore a bit some more. But in terms of, Professor Campbell, in terms of what you were saying in terms of the periodization and the different groups of Africans coming to Jamaica, yes, they definitely had a, so some scholars argue, especially the group from Akampong, they believe that the group, so for the Maroons, they argue that all of the Maroon groups argue that they first emerged during the Spanish colonial periods, but scholars would say that only some of them emerged during the Spanish colonial period, while a group of Akampong, which was headed by Kojo, was made up of a lot of Akans that rebelled from the plantation because they had some plantations like the Downland plantation, some plantations where they have records of the leaders of in the Maroon community of Akampong and Kojo actually live in specific plantation, and they have some records of the groups that were on the plantation, and many of them were Akan that actually left the plantation. And they believe that the early Maroon groups usually organized around ethnic connection in terms of speaking the same language, having the same belief and systems, so that they're able to maybe be more coherent and united because of a shared history and culture, basically, in terms of where the origins came from. So it's also to scholarship has shown that usually when these groups emerge, the first group of people who create the group usually have a greater impact on how the group develops. So even though if the group developed mainly with Akans and other people were brought in, because the group foundation was Akan, it would actually continue many of those systems as they bring in new group of people. So that might explain some of why, you know, in terms of why Akan is so significant within the group of Maroons, because the time that the community emerged, especially under the British, there were a lot of Akans. And so in Jamaica, I should have mentioned this, in Jamaica, and in the in the Jamaica and in the Dutch-speaking Americas, people that came from what is today Ghana, the Gold Coast, Ivory Coast, Togo, the people that came from that area, they are referred to as Coromantee in the English-speaking Caribbean and the Dutch-speaking Americas, Caribbean. And it's interesting enough, those in the Danish, Portuguese, Spanish, Americas, they were called Minas. And it's tied to, actually, there's a fort in Ghana that is called Elmina, and there's a fort in Ghana that is also called Coromantee. So it is believed to that also to that the idea when we talk about Pan-Africanism and African people creating a shared identity. So it is also possible that the people that came from Ghana or the Gold Coast, and they call themselves Coromantee, that they might not have all been a Kamikaze through the Coromantee fort and through the Elmina fort. Africans as far as Timbuktu came through the fort. Africans as far as Burkina Faso, Mali, Sierra Leone, from different parts actually went through certain ports. So it could also be the effect of Africans building community on the ships in the barracoons and carrying those identities in the Americas. So there's some research trying to explore that some more in terms of what Hilary Beckles were talking about in terms of periodization. And in terms of the military organization, the Maroons, so the leader of the Maroon community is called a colonel, and that's a military title actually. So they used to be called chiefs, but they're called colonels, sometimes chiefs sometimes. But for the Maroons, if you ever been to a Maroon community and you go through the areas that they live in, like the forest, I did, when I was there, I hiked through the areas that they live in. And where the Akampa Maroon live in, the area that they live in is a place called Cockpit Country. It's a very unique, diverse place in Jamaica. I think it's the most unique, diverse place that have unique fauna and fauna in that area. And that area is about maybe 200 square miles in terms of size. But that area also has backside in that area where the Jamaican state is also interested in mining. But within that area, when I was hiking with some Maroon community members, the forest is so thick, the area is so thick there that if you are walking, like you cannot see, maybe you see maybe this far ahead of you in terms of the thickness of the trees and the forest itself. You cannot see very far. And for the Maroons, what they did for the most times was they actually wrapped themselves in leaves and trees. And so sometimes they were able to take the weapons from the British. But for the Maroons, the British in their red coats are traveling through this deep forest. And for the Maroons, they would often have matches where they could chop actually 3-5 British heads before they even know that a Maroon is among them. Because if you see the camouflage that they use, like they have reports where there was this gentleman that said the trees were moving, the trees were alive, but it was actually Maroons covered in trees. And so they would lure the British in their red coats into the forest, and for most of the battles they would lose because they are not used to fighting in the forest. Maybe they're used to fighting in independent fields. And they used to call the Maroons as cowards, that they wouldn't face them. But for the Maroons, they were using guerrilla tactics, where they were using the terrain to their advantage. So it was very difficult for the British to defeat them within that context. But the British was also able to maybe destroy a lot of their vegetation. So they had to find ways of moving and surviving. And they basically use these different tactics. So in 1776, when they had the Second Maroon War, the Jamaican state itself thought, British state to the Jamaican, thought that this Maroon rebellion, they'll be able to crush it within days, they thought. But the Maroons went back to the hills, and it took them about 6-7 months to crush the rebellion, the resistance. But it completely drained the Jamaican treasury, that the Jamaican government decided never to attack the Maroon directly. Their goal was to use other means of weakening the Maroons during their engagement with the Maroons. And even though the British signed a treaty with the Maroons, they signed a treaty in mind of we'll find another way of getting rid of the group, you know. But when the Maroons signed the treaty, they signed the treaty with the idea that they would remain autonomous, and the idea of them being independent. It's among the Maroons as a long tradition, and you see it not only in the oral tradition, but you also see it in the archives. When you look at the archives, you see the Jamaican Maroons claiming certain things, where the British are acting surprised that the Maroons are claiming certain things. But you see a constant claim of autonomy, you see a constant claim of territory. So for the Jamaican Maroons in the western part of Jamaica, they claim like most of the western part of Jamaica. The Jamaican government acknowledged about 15 acres of territory that the Maroon control. But the Maroon claim that they control up to 25% of western Jamaica. And their territory include going all the way towards the sea. As you would see when I interview different Maroons that have never met each other, they would have similar narratives, similar stories of from seashore to seashore. That's where their territory is located. And then you would see in the British archives, 5 years wouldn't pass where you don't see a Maroon claiming land that seems so far from the present settlement that they are located on. So every 5 years, Maroon are claiming more and more territory. In the east, where the Maroons are located, they claim, the idea is that they have Motown as one community. But if you go to Motown now, they would tell you that about 15 other communities neighboring to them are also Maroon communities. And they don't make a lot of noise about it, but the British document actually acknowledged they're expanding and owning those communities. For the British, they are saying the Maroons are expanding. For the Maroons, they are saying these communities were always ours. And the Maroons in the East, the British state, acknowledged their claiming of those communities during different time periods. But in the West, the British state didn't acknowledge their claims to other parts. But they are also the community, out of all the community in the West is the community that talk about sovereignty the most. So they're the one who felt that their sovereignty isn't acknowledged. So they speak about it in louder terms, while those in the East, they speak of sovereignty, but they don't speak of it as much. But their neighboring communities have been acknowledged as being part of their communities.
We'll keep going with questions.
You mentioned in your talk that there are other Maroon communities, or were, not sure if it's are or were. You mentioned in passing St. Vincent and I think Dominica. And so I'm just curious if you could speak specifically to any other Maroon communities in the smaller islands throughout the Caribbean.
Okay, so I mean, there were I would say were in the small islands. So in the small islands, they were much smaller. So Maroons would usually go to the hills, set up their own communities, but small islands like the island that I'm from the Caribbean, St. Kitts and Nevis where I'm from. The island is about 6 miles long and 6 miles wide, very small. So when the plantation expanded, it was very difficult for the Maroon community to survive on those small islands. So they have documentation of Africans fleeing the plantation and actually using boats. You don't need very large boats to actually make it to neighboring islands. So in places like St. Vincent and Dominica, there are a lot of reports of Africans leaving these small islands and going to St. Vincent or Dominica, where these areas were stronghold of actually the indigenous people. there. The Tainos and the Caribs were indigenous to those places. And they were indigenous to the Caribbean generally, before the European came and started committing genocide in the neighboring island. So most of them gravitated to St. Vincent and Dominica. And Africans used to go to these communities, and at first they wasn't fully accepting them, but as their number did dwindle, they started accepting more and more Africans coming to the island. So you have a group of people known as Garafunas that were very influential in St. Vincent, where they were able to maintain autonomy for a very long time. But they started accepting Africans coming to their community. And in the late 1700s, that community got into a war with the British, and they were defeated and they were sent to Central America. So you have Garafunas today that are still in Central America, maybe 300,000 living in Belize and Honduras. And you have Garafunas even in New York City and in different parts of the place, but their ancestry is indigenous and African mixed. So in the smaller islands, they mainly join those indigenous communities. And most of the communities in the small islands were wiped out. So they aren't much evidence that they lasted into the post-colonial period in the small islands. Is mainly in Jamaica, they survived up to today. You had Maroon communities in Haiti, but after the revolution, a lot of the Maroon communities merged with the Haitian society. You have a lot of Maroon communities in Suriname. So some people, Suriname is always on the mainland of South America. It's considered also a Caribbean community. And in Suriname, there are about 6 different communities of Maroon, 6 influential Maroon communities in Suriname. And in many ways, they have more influence and power in terms of autonomy. I would argue maybe more than even the Jamaican communities. But those communities also, interesting enough, also trace their ancestry to Ghana and Akan. And they also have that Ghana-Akan influence. But also too, you have in Colombia, you have Palenque Sao Basilio is still existing. They argue that there is some debate about their origins, but people often argue that they are actually the oldest surviving Maroon community in the Americas. The oldest Maroon community is known was in Mexico, a place called Yanka. And that community still exists today, but interestingly enough, there are not much people visibly of African descent when you go to the community. Some scholars have wrote about how the community might have dissipated in some ways, because when Yanka was formed in Mexico, they built a military base close to the community. And so many of the members gravitated away from the community. And then you have in Brazil, where you have what is referred to as quilombos. And so in Brazil, about 700, 800 quilombos are acknowledged in Brazil. And they believe to be much, much more communities exist in Brazil that are quilombos there. But the quilombos in Brazil are organized more on community basis. It's a little bit different from the communities like in Jamaica and maybe Suriname. And where else is Maroon community? So yeah, those are the main areas where Maroon communities are. They have Maroon communities, of course, in the United States. They have the Black Seminoles, which was a mixture of people of African descent and the Seminoles. And those communities emerged mainly around Florida, South Carolina, Georgia. And many of those communities, when the United States was seceding from the British, some of them actually sided with the British in terms of fighting against the American government. And so when the British was defeated, many of them migrated to the Bahamas and some neighboring islands. But they're more or less remnants of the community, but they do not have a community like how you have in Jamaica, where this particular space and community is exclusively Maroon and Maroon control.
We have a question online from Ms. Deal. So it's 3 questions. Said, hello, Professor Nisbett. Is it true that the most unruly captives and enslaved people were sent to Jamaica? Also, what is the relationship of the Maroons community to the Rasta community? And did you say that the Maroons called their spirituality Koromati as opposed to Obeah Christianity? And lastly, do you think the Maroons still train warriors and diviners to the same degree that they were trained around the time that they fought against the British?
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I remember all of the questions. The first one, I'm not so sure about the most really unruly was sent to Jamaica. I'm not sure. I've heard it, but I'm not sure. I think that different groups of Africans were sent different places. What you see among the Akan in the diaspora in the Americas, there were maybe 10% of the Africans enslaved in the Americas. And what is unique about the Akan may be different from the Igbo and the different groups of Africans during the time period. In Ghana itself, when the slave trade developed, for the first 200 years, actually very few, if any, Africans actually left the Gold Coast. And then for the last 200 years, it was many people from the Gold Coast came into the transatlantic slave trade, but they only represent about 10% of those enslaved in the Americas. And, but in Ghana itself, there were hundreds of states. So there were hundreds of states and West Africa itself. And so many of the people, I would argue, were familiar with state building, building states and building communities and kingdoms. So when the Ashanti was expanding, then they had like where, the Ashanti expanded where they were able to conquer basically all of the neighboring states, and the territory was basically the size of Ghana and actually going into Togo. They were going into Ivory Coast, and they were actually go as far as Burkina Faso in terms of the size of their territory. But many of the people that came to Jamaica, especially the Akan, they were war veterans. They used to warfare. They were war veterans. So when they came to Jamaica, and there's an excellent book written by Vincent Brown at Harvard, where he talks about Taki's War. So Taki was an African that came from the Gold Coast, and he formed the largest rebellion in the British Empire ever. And the interesting story he gave about Taki is that Taki was actually, he was born in Ghana, and he actually knew people who were involved in the slave trade. And he was an influential person on the coast. And somehow he actually was taken away into the slave trade, and he was sent to Jamaica. And when he got to Jamaica, he was a slave on a plantation, a particular plantation. And there was actually a ship captain that actually ended up owning a plantation himself in Jamaica. And when he was visiting another planter, he saw the person Taki. And he was surprised because he was influential in Africa. And he was I think, he was influential in Africa. He was surprised he was on a plantation. And then anyway, so both of them started talking, and actually Taki used to go to the farmer captain house and eat dinner with him actually on every Sunday. And the captain said he was going to speak to his the slave owner, the slave holder, who actually was residing in the UK at this time. And he was going to the UK, and he went to the UK to speak on Taki's behalf so he could get back to Ghana, basically at the Gold Coast. But the gentleman he met actually died in the UK before coming back. And then 4 years later, Taki actually formed a rebellion, and he knew military tactics because he used to fight in with, different groups in Ghana. He used to, because within Ghana, after they started interacting with the Europeans, there were different change in terms of warfare using military weapons, especially guns, changed the formation of war tactics on the continent itself, but also it influenced a lot of the war veterans that were actually in Jamaica. So you have the Akans, when they are in different parts of the Americas, they didn't cause every rebellion, but in terms of proportion and numbers, in relation to their size, they were part of many Maroon communities and they were part of many rebellions. So, so I think in the early period of Jamaica, a lot of people from the Gold Coast ended up in Jamaica. But arguably, I think that maybe later on, more people actually came from Nigeria, but because of that kind tradition of maybe warfare and state building, they carry these legacies to the Americas. I mean, and it was so complicated that some scholars even highlight where some of the animosity actually on the continent sometimes emerged in the Americas, where they have different groups of Maroons actually sometimes fighting each other. You would have Maroons siding with a particular European power to fight another European power. You have one Maroon group siding with a European power against another group of Maroons. So it was very complicated, especially when the different European powers started taking territories from the Spanish. So you have where Maroon communities started emerging in many different parts of the Americas. Everywhere in the Americas, they have Maroon communities. So that's the first question. And the second one is, remind me of the second question.
What is the relationship of the Maroons community to the Rasta community?
I think that the connection is the spirit, I think, of resistance and independence. But when I visited the Maroon communities, there were many Rastas there. People practice Rastafari in the Maroon communities. So, so many Maroons embrace Rastafari, but they came from different legacies, but I think that they are related in the sense of resisting and rejecting European imperialism, colonization, and trying to create independent space that's connected to the African continent. So they have the same spirit and energy, but it's in different, maybe in different form, but they also merge in the sense that many Maroons practice Rastafarian. And then the other question was about, so in terms of Coromantee, in terms of the religion, so there are 4 Maroon communities. So the 3 Maroon communities of Scott Hall, Scott Hall, Charlestown, and Moortown, the Maroons in the east, they call their religious practice Coromantee play. But the Accompong Maroons, they would use the word, they wouldn't use Coromantee play as much, but they practice the same thing, but they call it different names. So Obia itself is also a practice that they also believe in. I'm trying to remember Mayal is what they call the religious expression in Accompong, but it's like Coromantee play. The Coromantee play is basically a religious practice. The most expressive form maybe is where actually some of the members of the community could actually be possessed by the ancestors. So Nani, Kojo, they could actually come and appear and speak to the community and give the community direction and guidance. When they go into these different trance, they try to connect with the ancestors that way. And for the most part, when the people are in trance, they say that they don't remember being in a trance, but they would be speaking and saying things about the community, about certain things. And it's called Obia, it's called Coromantee play, it's called Mayal, it's called different names, but it's very much the same expression. So there's that connection. And they oftentimes call Obia in the Maroon community, they actually call it science. rather than Obia. Obia is like what when people talk about voodoo, when people speak of voodoo, of this idea of, you're doing black magic or whatever. It's sort of seen as where the plantation owner considered Obia to be a bad thing because oftentimes they would use these religious practices to challenge, colonialism, slavery. And so Obia is often given a bad name, so oftentimes they use the word science. And science is a way of connecting with God and try to improve your standing, basically. So they are interconnected.
Might I just say something really quick regarding the Obia? I'm from Antigua, by the way.
Okay.
And in Antigua, Obia is actually illegal, as in there's a book, there's a law on the books that could lead to criminal prosecution if you are caught practicing Obia. And so when you speak to the fact that it is kind of frowned upon and there's a negative connotation around it, like that is not a joke. It's actually in some parts of the Caribbean, and I could speak specifically to Antigua, it's actually considered illegal.
I think it's, I don't know if it's still on the books of what islands, but it's from the colonial period, it was considered illegal. And I think many of the independent state kept those laws. And most people wouldn't identify with being Obia worker, but especially I grew up in St. Kitts and Nevis too, and St. Thomas, and Obia is also seen as a very bad thing. And no one would, at least where I grew up, no one would say I practice Obia. But in Jamaica, at least among the Maroon communities, I met some elders that tell me, yes, I'm an Obia man, and I could do all of these different things. So they embrace it, at least in the Maroon community. But in Jamaica, it's also still shunned as something bad and something you shouldn't associate with. Rastafari also criticized Obia to sometimes too. Like it's frowned upon in many ways, but people often go to it when sometimes they feel, and this happened also, it seemed like in Ghana, to my experience there, it's like when you feel a church isn't working, then maybe you go to the Obia man to help you with something. Of the solution, but you don't tell anybody about it, really.
Well, so we'll have a question from Professor Ruffin, and after that, we can take a break and get some food, and the Zoom audience can also get your dinner, and then we can come back in about 10 minutes and continue the conversation. Does that work for you, yes, Professor Nisbett? So, Professor Ruffin, please ask your question.
Hey, Mario, how you doing? Do you hear me?
Yes, okay.
Okay, well, you just raised something that raises another question to me, but what I'm gonna do is just bring some things up first for the group. One is that there was also a big Seminole presence within a place like Texas, Brackettville. So if you look at the work of Ian Hancock, who was out of UT Austin, doing this type of work, there's a lot of great work there, where it was discovered in the 70s. About 100 miles west of San Antonio, there are Black colonies out there. In terms of dealing with, and you probably already know this, but African origins, there are some hidden special files inside the National Archives within England, in London. So that's where you'll find some of that information. And also, one of the big questions I have is, have you, inside your new work, you're going to be dealing with a broader range of dealing with Maroon societies. Have you looked at the archives, the archives at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, in particular in 1992? That Folk Life Festival had a huge Maroon program that had taken place. And in particular, tons of recordings that they have. I don't know if it's still, well, it still exists. I don't know if it exists in there or if it exists within the new African American Museum that they have. But those are some questions. And then just one more that you just raised up is it concerns the practice of obeah, as you had talked about, or religious practices. And it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, that for the most part, in places where you had larger land spaces, geographical spaces, you know, Maroon societies could flourish better, as well as practice along these type of lines, as opposed to being inside smaller places. And with the thought in mind, places like Barbados, still you had places where people could hide in caves and stuff, but it was a lot more limited. I'll leave it there and hear what you have to say.
Okay, so thank you. Yes, I haven't done much research, but yes, there are Black Seminoles in Texas and Mexico too. I remember also reading that there are also some in Mexico, especially when the United States had a conflict with Texas and Mexico. The Maroons were involved in some of those conflicts, and some actually ended up going to Mexico itself, and some are in Texas. In terms of the Smithsonian, I visited the Library of Congress and Smithsonian. Actually, the foremost expert probably on Maroon communities, Kenneth Bilby, actually worked at the Library of Congress for about 30 years. He's now at the University of, I think, Colorado, but he has been there for some time. And so the Smithsonian in 1992, the event that you talked about, there was a publication that actually came out about the Maroon communities, and that came, so the Maroon communities came actually from different places, including Jamaica, and actually interviewed one of the Maroons in Jamaica. He actually talked about his experience going to the Smithsonian, and it was a period that he was really excited about, because he was the original drum maker in the community at the time. He recently passed away, and he went to that event, and it was something that he remembered in great detail. So they actually have a lot of documents there at the National Archives because of Bilby too. Especially songs, music, they have a lot of records there. But I'm thinking of moving away from so much about the Maroons and maybe focusing more on Ghana and its interaction with the diaspora. And then the last point you made about larger spaces. Yes, it seemed like, especially when it comes to islands, it seemed like larger spaces created greater opportunities for Maroon communities to exist and create an independent space for my research. So they have different kinds of what is referred to as Maroonage, where is the process of becoming a Maroon, the process of fleeing slavery. So sometimes you have individual Maroonage, where some people would say Frederick Douglass was practicing Maroonage, moving from the south to the north in the United States, and the Underground Railroad as a form of Maroonage to the north and Canada itself. And then you have maritime Maroonage, where people speak about Africans moving across the seas to find freedom. So these comes, the idea of maritime Maroonage, especially popular in the Caribbean because of the small island space and being able to move to different places, created that phenomenon, greater percentage than perhaps bigger spaces where you could just go to the forest lands.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Nisbett, and thank you to the Zoom audience, to the in-person audience. The questions have been so thoughtful, and your responses have been equally as provocative. And I know we do want to continue the discussion, but we do have to take a break. So Zoom members, get your dinner. We'll get some dinner and come back and just talk informally. And Dr. Nisbett has kindly agreed to just sit with us as we continue the informal conversation. So thank you, everyone.